Why does a beginner Japanese woodworking project teach you more in one weekend than a year of watching build videos ever will? Because almost every one of them strips the job down to 2 or 3 cuts that have to be right, and there is nowhere to hide a sloppy one. No screws to pull it tight, no filler. I have been at a garage bench for more than 25 years, and I wasted a lot of my first years building things that were too big and too forgiving. A bookshelf hides a bad cut, a tea tray does not. These 16 projects run from about an hour of work to a couple of weekends, and every one of them leaves you holding something you actually keep. Stay with me to the end, because the last one on the list is the piece that looks like real furniture, sits in your living room, and is built from nothing but stacked boxes. And somewhere in the middle, I am going to give you the one-dimension rule that decides whether a project looks Japanese or looks like a shop class box. And it has nothing to do with joinery. One thing before the list, because I know the first question. You do not need much. A Japanese pull saw, a Gyokucho Ryoba at about $35, cuts nearly everything here, and a couple of sharp chisels like a Narex set for around $50 will handle the rest. Add a block plane, a square, and a marking knife, and you are equipped for every project on this list. My club buddy has a shop that looks like a tool catalog, and he has not finished a piece in 2 years. The gear is not the bottleneck. Start with the smallest thing on the list, because it is the one that changes your hands. Chopsticks. Hashi is the Japanese word for them, and hashioki is the little rest the tips sit on. You take a scrap of hardwood, something dense like cherry or walnut, and you plane a stick down from square to tapered until it feels right. That is the whole project, and it takes about 20 minutes once you get going. You are burning almost no material and you are not risking anything. What it teaches is worth far more than the chopsticks. This is where you feel, for the first time, the difference between a plane that is sharp and one that is just sort of sharp. On a tapered stick that thin, you get instant feedback. A sharp iron leaves a surface that shines, and a shaving you can see light through. A dull one crushes and skates and leaves fuzz. You cannot fake it, and you cannot sand your way out of it. The way you actually do it is you plane a square stick down first, something like 3/8 of an inch on a side, roughly the width of a pencil. Then you taper it toward the tip by taking more passes at the far end than the near end. Count your strokes. 10 passes at the tip, 6 in the middle, 2 at the top, and you get an even taper without measuring anything. Then knock the 4 corners off to make it 8-sided, and knock those down again if you want it round. That progression, square to 8-sided to round, is how spindles have been shaped by hand for a very long time, and you just learned it on a chopstick. I made about a dozen mismatched pairs before I had 2 that matched. My wife pointed out that a set of chopsticks where every stick is a different thickness is not, technically, a set. She was right. If you saw the sharpening video, you already know a keen edge does the work instead of your shoulder. Chopsticks are where that stops being a thing you heard and becomes a thing you felt. Second on the list, and this is the one I would push anybody toward first if they want an object with a name, is a masu. That is the little square wooden box, traditionally cedar, that sake gets served in. 4 sides mitered at 45 degrees, a bottom, and nothing else. Sounds like a beginner box. It is not, and that is exactly why it works. A miter, which just means both mating pieces are cut at half the corner angle, so they meet in a clean point, is unforgiving. Cut your 45 at 45.5 degrees, and every corner opens up a gap you can see across the room. 4 corners multiply the error, and with a masu you cannot argue with the result, because it was designed to hold liquid. A gappy masu is a leaky cup. There is no other project that grades your miter saw setup that hard. I built 3 of them before I got a clean one. The first 2 went in the burn pile. That was maybe $4 of cedar, to learn my miter gauge was off by half a degree, which is cheaper than finding that out on a picture frame in walnut. And I know some of you are thinking, half a degree, come on. Across 4 corners you stack that error 4 times, and a half degree at each becomes a gap at the last joint you can slide a business card into. That is the whole reason to build the small one first. And there is a trick that saves you here that almost nobody mentions. Do not trust the printed 45 on your miter gauge or your saw. Cut 2 scrap pieces, put the 2 mitered faces together, and lay them on something flat. If the 2 pieces make a clean 90-degree corner, with no light showing, your 45 is right. If they open up or overlap, your angle is off by half the error you see, because you doubled it across 2 cuts. Adjust and test again. 5 minutes with scrap tells you the truth about your setup, and it is the same test whether you are cutting on a table saw, a miter saw, or with a hand saw and a shooting board. Once it is dialed in, the masu comes together in an hour. For glue, plain yellow PVA, Type Bond 2 or 3, at about $10 a bottle, is all you need, and a strap or a band clamp pulls all 4 corners at once, better than trying to wrangle 4 separate clamps around a small box. The third project scales that same idea up into something useful. An obon, a Japanese serving tray. Shallow rim, thin bottom panel, and the rim either mitered like the masu or rabbited, which just means you cut a step along the edge so the bottom drops in and sits flush. Weekend build. And it teaches the thing that ruins beginners on any wide flat piece, which is keeping a thin panel flat. A bottom panel around 1/4 inch thick, roughly the width of a pencil, has almost no stiffness of its own, so it takes whatever shape the frame around it wants. Build the frame square and it stays flat. Build it out of wind, which is the old word for twisted, and the panel twists with it. My wife uses ours every single morning, which is more than I can say for most of what I have built. Fourth, and this is where a lot of guys stall out, is a kumiko coaster or trivet. Kumiko is the thin lattice work you see in Japanese screens and cabinet doors. Strips friction fit into a grid with almost no glue. People see a whole kumiko panel and quit before they start. Do not build a panel. Build a coaster. A 4-inch square with a simple asanoha or square pattern is a real piece of kumiko, and it will take you an afternoon and about $1 of scrap. The strips are thin, maybe 1/8 of an inch, about the thickness of a coffee stirrer, and if your angles are off by even a whisker, nothing seats. That is the point. It is the cheapest accuracy test in woodworking, and you find out on $1 of pine instead of $40 of cherry. Fifth, and the one everybody asks about when they see it in your house, is an andon. That is a Japanese paper lantern lamp, a light frame of thin stock, shoji paper stretched on the panels, and an LED puck light dropped inside. Nothing on it is structural, nothing holds weight, which is exactly why it is a great early project, because you get an enormous visual payoff for very simple joinery. A roll of real shoji paper runs about $15 and will do several lamps. One safety note that is not optional: use an LED, which stays cool. Do not put an incandescent bulb inside a paper box. I should not have to say it, and yet. That takes us out of the small stuff. Here is where the list gets into real construction, and where the dimension rule I promised comes in, because you can build every joint on this list perfectly and still end up with something that looks wrong. The sixth project is a shoji-style sliding panel or a cabinet door. Frame and panel construction, which just means a solid outer frame with a lighter panel captured in a groove inside it, plus a lattice grid across the opening. This is the andon with the training wheels off. And here is the thing that catches everybody. A frame that is not square racks, which means it leans into a parallelogram instead of a rectangle, and once a door racks, it binds in its opening forever. On a door about 30 inches tall, roughly knee to chest, being out of square by 1/16 of an inch at one corner, about the thickness of a nickel, is enough that it rubs on one side and gaps on the other. You check that by measuring corner to corner both diagonals. When the two diagonals match, the frame is square. That one check has saved more of my projects than any tool I own. And now the dimension rule, because this is the part nobody tells you. What makes these pieces read as Japanese is not the joinery. It is the proportions and the restraint. Thin parts, generous negative space, and a consistent ratio between the frame and the openings. Most beginners build everything too thick, because thick feels sturdy and safe, and thick is exactly what makes it look like a shop class project. A shoji frame member might be around 3/4 of an inch, about the thickness of a fat marker, with lattice strips down under 1/4 inch. If your instinct says double that, resist it. The whole visual language is lightness. Same reason a masu has thin walls. Once you see that, you will look at your old projects differently, and you will understand why a piece with perfect joints can still look clumsy. Sit with that a second. You can cut every joint on a piece dead tight and still get it wrong, because the eye reads proportion before it reads craftsmanship. Number 7 takes you into wet room work, and it is traditional through and through. A furo isu, the low bath stool used in a Japanese bathing room, a cedar seat, 4 short legs, and through tenons, which just means the tenon, the tongue on the end of the leg, passes all the way through the seat, and shows on top. Then you drive a small wedge into a saw kerf in the end of that tenon, which spreads it inside the hole and locks it. A wedged-through tenon does not loosen the way a glued butt joint does, because it is mechanically locked, not just stuck. That is the joint that has held chairs together for centuries. Eighth, and staying with water, is an O4O caddy, the slatted tray that bridges a bathtub. Cedar slats, 2 cleats underneath, done in an afternoon. Cedar earns its place here, because it handles moisture and resists rot far better than pine or poplar. That is not folklore. It is the same reason cedar shows up in siding and fence posts. Real hinoki, Japanese cypress, is the traditional choice, and it is beautiful, but it runs expensive in the States. Western red cedar does the same job for a fraction, and I have never regretted using it. Which brings me to where these two do not work, because this is a bathroom and I want to be straight with you. Do not use a hard film finish, meaning a polyurethane or a lacquer that sits on top as a plastic skin, on either of these. In a room that goes from steaming hot to dry twice a day, that film will crack, water gets under it, and it lifts and goes cloudy, and you are stripping it in a year. Traditional bath pieces are often left bare or finished with a simple oil, and that is the right call. Also, do not build these out of green or wet stock. If your board reads much above 12% on a moisture meter, and a general tools meter is about $30, let it sit in your shop before you cut. A wet board keeps moving after you build it, and in a humid Gulf Coast summer, versus a dry heated house in a Minnesota January, that same stool can go from tight to rattling. I built a small cedar bench out of stock. I had not let settle, and by the next winter one leg was loose. Same wood movement idea that ruins tabletops, just in a smaller package. Number 9 is a shoe cabinet, a getabako, or call it a mudroom shelf if you like. Open front shelf unit, cubbies for shoes, straight cuts and dados. A dado is a flat-bottomed groove cut across the grain, and it is how the shelves land in the sides. Nothing here is technically hard. What makes it read Japanese is again the proportions, thin verticals, open front, no doors, and the shelf spacing regular. And this is your first real casework, which just means a built box that carries load, so it is the honest step up from trays and boxes. Cut your dados about 1/3 of the thickness of the side, so on 3/4 inch stock, that is 1/4 inch deep, about the width of a pencil. Deeper than that, and you are just removing material that was holding the side together. Shallower, and the shelf has nothing to sit in. And keep every cubby the same height, because the eye catches an inconsistent gap far faster than it catches a joint that is a hair open. A shoe shelf carries real weight in a spot people kick and bump, so this is where a piece that racks shows up fast. Add a back panel, even a thin one, and it stops the whole cabinet from leaning sideways over time. That thin back is doing more structural work than anything else on the piece, and it is the part beginners leave off to save a few dollars. 10 on the list is the one that sounds like homework until you do it once. A kigumi joint practice set. Kigumi means wooden joinery in the broad sense, and the idea is you cut a handful of joints on scrap, not to assemble into anything, just to cut them, look at them, and keep them on a shelf. Everybody skips this. Everybody then goes and cuts their first half lap directly on the expensive wood. A half lap, where you remove half the thickness from each of 2 pieces so they cross flush, is maybe 15 minutes on scrap, and you will cut 3 bad ones before a good one. That is not failure, that is tuition. And pine is cheaper tuition than walnut. Do the math on the way most of us learn. Ruin a board every few projects, call it $40, 3 or 4 times a year, for 10 years. That is well over $1,000 of good hardwood in the burn pile, all avoidable with a scrap in 20 minutes. Number 11 is the zaisu, the legless floor chair. Seat, back, no legs, and it sits directly on the floor. Simple parts, but the lesson is the back angle. Set the back dead vertical at 90 degrees, and it is flat out uncomfortable, and it wants to tip you forward. Lean it back around 100 to 105 degrees, which is a hand's width of lean at the top, and it suddenly works, because your weight loads into the back instead of fighting it. That is the first time most people build something where comfort is a measurable angle and not a guess. 12. A display stand. 2 uprights with matching curved cradles, sitting on a base. It goes fast, it looks sharp, and the whole skill is cutting one curve, and then cutting an identical second one. The trick is, you do not cut them separately. You stack the two blanks, tape or clamp them together, and cut both at once, so any wander happens to both identically. That stack cutting habit shows up in half of everything you build after. Number 13, changes your shop instead of your house. A planing beam or a bench hook. It is a scrap of wood with a stop on each end, hooked over the edge of your bench, and it gives you something to plane or saw against without clamping every time. Costs nothing. Takes 15 minutes. And this is where I disagree with most of the beginner project lists out there. They push you straight at furniture. The shop fixtures are what make the furniture possible, and a bench hook and a planing stop will do more for your hand tool work this year than any project on this list. 14 brings the wood movement lesson home in the most useful object you can own, a cutting board with breadboard ends. The board is a glued-up panel. A breadboard end is a strip of wood capping each end of that panel, running crossways to the grain. That end cap has to float, which means it is pinned in the middle and the outer pins ride in slotted holes so the panel can grow and shrink underneath it. Because it will. A 12-inch wide board, about the length of a sheet of paper, can move close to a 1/4 inch across its width, between a humid summer and a dry, heated winter, which is the gap of 2 stacked quarters. Glue that end cap solid across its whole length and the panel cracks. Not maybe. It is the same principle from the tabletop side of things, and a cutting board is the cheapest way to actually build it and watch it work over a year. Number 15 is the toolbox, and this is the one I wish I had built first. The traditional Japanese toolbox is about as plain as an object gets. Straight cedar or pine boards, no dovetails, no fancy joints at all, held together with nails or pegs, and a lid that slides under 2 fixed battens and locks with 1 removable batten pinned at the end. Chris Schwartz over at Lost Art Press has written about this box at length and built a bunch of them, and the reason it keeps coming back is that it is nearly all layout and almost no joinery. Every part is a straight cut, which means every error you make is a layout error, and you can see exactly where it came from. There is no complicated joint to blame. A weekend, about $20 of pine, and you end up with something that holds a full kit of tools and gets better looking as it gets beat up. Let me be fair about something before somebody says it in the comments. A few of these are Japanese informed rather than strictly traditional named forms. A display stand, a bench hook, a breadboard cutting board. Those are shapes and habits that overlap with Western work too. And I am not going to pretend every item here has 1,000 years of documented lineage behind it. The toolbox, the masu, the kumiko, the shoji, the furo isu, the kaidan dansu, those are the real named traditions. The rest are built in the same spirit. Thin stock, careful layout, no fasteners doing work that geometry should do. Both kinds are worth your Saturday. I just would rather tell you which is which than have you find out from a stranger. I put off building one for years because it looked too simple to bother with. That was backwards. The simplicity is the feature. Toshio Odate, who trained as a tategushi, a Japanese fittings maker, wrote the book most American woodworkers first learned this tradition from, and the thing that comes through is how little the old shops relied on clever joints for ordinary objects. Straight boards, careful layout, done. Now the one I have been holding back, because it is the piece that looks like furniture and it is built out of nothing but boxes. A kaidan dansu is a Japanese step chest, a staircase-shaped cabinet that historically doubled as actual stairs in a house with no room for both. You do not build a full one. You build a 2- or 3-step version, about knee height, that lives at the end of a hallway or beside a bed. And the reason it belongs on a beginner list is that it is not one complicated build. It is 3 simple boxes of decreasing height, joined into a stepped stack. That is the reframe I want to leave you with. Every casework piece you have ever been intimidated by is boxes. A dresser is boxes. A kitchen cabinet run is boxes. Once you can build one square box with a dado for a shelf, you can build a stepped chest, because it is that same box 3 times with the sides cut to different heights. The joinery does not get harder as the piece gets bigger. Only the layout does. Build the boxes with dados and rabbets. Screw or peg them together where the faces meet. And cap the whole thing with a top that overhangs by around a 1/2 inch, roughly the width of your thumbnail, so the eye reads a shadow line instead of a raw edge. Keep the stock thin, 3/4 or even 5/8, because of that proportion rule. A guy in my woodworking club built one last winter out of poplar for maybe $60 in material, put a dark oil on it, and every single person who walks into his house asks where he bought it. He has stopped correcting them. He just says thank you. None of these 16 asks you to own a jointer or a planer or a $5,000 setup. They ask you to cut straight, lay out carefully, and keep your parts thinner than your gut tells you to. Pick the chopsticks or the masu this weekend, because both cost a scrap and an afternoon, and both will tell you something true about your hands and your tools. Next time I want to build one of these start to finish, the toolbox, so you can see how much of it is layout and how little is joinery. Go make some sawdust.